Alright, so this is Chapter 12, the Second War for Independence and the Upsurge of Nationalism, 1812 to 1824. Not quite as important as the previous two chapters, and this is the last chapter of the unit, but there are some big things that happen, especially on the diplomatic front, and as far as the securing more modern boundaries for our country. It talks about getting Florida and some other areas out in the southwest, in the Oregon territory. That stuff you do see tested a lot, so make sure you pay attention to that stuff. So we start with kind of one of the low points in American history, and that's when, during the War of 1812, when the British basically invaded Washington, D.C., and there were some militiamen that were supposed to be guarding the city, and they turned and ran as soon as they saw the British. It was called the Blandenburg Races because apparently it's a place called Blandenburg outside of D.C. And so unlike we would like to think that we had the staunch defense and fight to the last man to guard our capital, to guard the White House, to guard the core of our country, actually the Americans just turned and ran, and the British were able to go into the country unmolested, and they went right into the middle of the city, and they basically set fire to just about all of our most important government buildings. After they're done with this, they go on and they try and capture Baltimore. And the key to Baltimore is the harbor, and the key to the harbor is a fort called Fort McHenry. And so they start shelling it, they start surrounding it. Here, actually, the Americans put up a stiff defense, and this is where you're going to see one of the more important events and one of the more positive events in American history. So the Star Spangled Banner, it's a well-known fact that Francis Scott Key wrote it while he was on the ship, watching the battle proceed in the harbor in front of him, or around him, I should say. But what's less known is that the melody is actually from an old British bar song. It's called "To Anacreon in Heaven," and it's about this ancient Greek poet who wrote about women and drinking. And so these British dudes in the 1700s, they would be gentlemen, so the rich aristocracy. They would get together and have fine wine and fine beer and fine women, and then after dinner they would get together and sing. And they would sing the following song that I am going to sing for you on the next slide. So gather round, grab yourself a Gatorade, and feel free to sing along to Anacreon in Heaven. To Anacreon heaven, where he sat in full glee, a few sons of harmony sent a petition that he their inspirer and patron should be. When this answer arrived from that jolly old Grecian, voice, fiddle, and flute no longer be mute. I'll lend you my name, inspire you to boot, and besides I'll instruct you like me to entwine the myrtle of Venus with Bacchus vine. And that, my friends, is the greatest song you will ever hear Coach Enright sing. Okay, so here you can see this is a map of all the big battles of the War of 1812. In the blue, you can see American victories. In the red, you can see the British victories. We just talked about this area down here. So August 24th to 25th, colossal defeat for the Americans. But then right here in Baltimore is where you get the big win. You get the ill-fated invasion of Canada by the Americans. You see them beat back pretty handily there. And then probably most importantly is the Battle of New Orleans. And down here, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, um, which is pretty big for the history of Andrew Jackson, propels him to hero status. So let's talk about the Battle of New Orleans. So he's given the command of basically the Southern Army, if you want to call it that, and they're out west, and he's fighting a lot of the Indian allies of the British, and so one of them are I think they're the Creek Indian, if I remember right, and they had formed themselves, the Creeks, an area at Horseshoe Bend. It was a bend in the river, it looked like a horseshoe, and they thought that there's no way that the Americans could ever get there because the defenses were so nice. Not only does Jackson defeat their defenses, they proceed to massacre every single Indian there. I mean, it was bloody. There's stories of the river running red because of all the Indian blood. So pretty nasty. So after he crushes the Indians, the Americans are like, holy crap, this guy's actually pretty good. And so he's given the task of defending New Orleans, right, which is our big port that we just got. Very important for commanding the Mississippi River down there in the Gulf of Mexico. The problem is he doesn't have a whole lot of soldiers to do it. And so he marches to New Orleans. He basically sees what he has. And he grabs all the local militiamen. There's not a whole lot because it's Louisiana. It's not a very big area of Americans. But what New Orleans always was a base for pirates. And I mean, we're talking, those type of pirates. And so he goes to the different taverns and pubs and basically recruits a bunch of pirates to man the defenses. And his argument is the British is the most powerful navy in the world, and they're the ones who are policing the waters and killing the pirates when they see them. So if we can defeat the British, then it's easier to be a pirate. He also recruits a large number of free African Americans from the area. And this is pretty much the first time we see a large battle involving free blacks fighting for the United States. So you can see this is a whole hodgepodge of just random groups that Andrew Jackson kind of gets together and they throw up kind of a hasty defensive works, and then they wait for the British. The British attack and they do it like a full frontal assault. The problem for the British is that this area just north and just east of New Orleans is very, very swampy. So there's only a small kind of narrow area of dry land, and the British were forced to put all of their guys in this small little funnel almost. And Andrew Jackson created a funnel of death, basically. And so there's very hot conditions. The British are wearing those big red wool heavy coats. They're sweating their butts off, and they can only go so fast because there's so many of them in choke points. The Americans are shooting at them, and so they're falling, they're dying. They have to now climb over their friends, and it ends up being the worst defeat of the war. They lost over 2,000 soldiers. Only 70 Americans were lost. So this victory doesn't get much more epic. And Andrew Jackson, as a result, becomes a national hero. This is a big thing for nationalism in America. The only problem is the battle was fought 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent, so technically it wasn't even required or needed. Because 2 weeks earlier, on Christmas Eve, 1814, the Americans signed an armistice with Great Britain, where both sides agree to stop the fighting. Now, nobody really wins in this because they just restore their conquered territory, so that the boundaries go right back to how they were before the war, which is good in a way. However, it kind of shows that this war was a useless war, because none of the issues that the war hawks who instigated the war, none of the issues that they wanted had been settled at all. Perhaps a little bit of solving the Indian problem, but that's it. Now we have to talk about the Federalist grievances. The Federalists, there's not a whole lot of them left. They're tucked away in New England. Remember, they were the ones that were the big fans of the British to begin with, didn't like the French. So they voted against this war in 1812, and they're basically just grumbling in New England throughout this entire time period. They actually profit pretty well during the war because they engage in a lot of smuggling and a lot of illegal trade with Canada, which of course is a British colony. A small minority of them proposed secession, so that New England, some people in New England wanted to secede from the Union and form their own peace treaty with Britain. And so they sent some delegates to Hartford, Connecticut in 1814. And all they did is they bitch about Washington, D.C. and the Anti-Federalists and whatnot. And they wrote up a list of grievances, basically, that they agreed to. They were going to take back to their states and to take to the federal government. And some of the grievances is they demanded financial assistance from Washington, D.C. to compensate for lost trade, which, let's face it, they were engaging in black market trade, so that's a kind of a crappy excuse. They proposed a constitutional amendment of our magic fraction 2/3 before an embargo could be imposed. Remember all the issues that we had during the Jefferson administration that led to the war, with the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act and whatnot. Those were always passed by a majority vote, and so this Congress convention, I should say, wants a 2/3 vote before we can do an embargo. Also, before new states are admitted, which they didn't like all these Western states because they would be agrarian, pro-Jeffersonian type states, or when war was declared, because again, it only takes a majority vote in both houses before war is declared, which is kind of surprising because it's a pretty important legal activity. They sought to abolish the 3/5 clause, because you remember that the South were having inflated numbers in the House of Representatives as a result of the 3/5 clause, and they had the Federalists had not a lot of support in the South at all. Limit presidents to a single term, so you kept getting these two-termers from Virginia, whereas they only had one president, John Adams, and it was only for one term, which, again, brings us to the next one. They also wanted to prohibit the election of two successive presidents from the same state. This one seems ridiculous, especially in 2013, but back then, remember, there were still state loyalties oftentimes were much more important and much more strong than American loyalties. And you kept having all these presidents from Virginia. It was called the Virginia Dynasty, and so the Federalists in New England, they didn't like this, and they thought it would give them a better chance of electing one of their own guys if they could break up this Virginia Dynasty. This is just a political cartoon at the time about the Hartford Convention, and you can see this is supposed to be the King of England over here. And it says, "Oh, my Yankee boys, jump into my fine fellows, plenty of molasses and codfish, plenty of goods to smuggle, honor, cities, and nobility into the bargain." So the King of England is trying to lure New England into secession. Here are the facts of the war. 6,000 Americans were killed or wounded. This is a minuscule amount. I believe we're well over that now for the Iran and Iraq war the past decade or so. And those are considered to be very small-scale wars. What the good part, I guess, is that America showed that it wasn't afraid to fight. That we weren't just going to be pushed over by our stronger guys. This war absolutely just kills the Federalist Party. By 1817, the Federalist Party doesn't exist anymore. And with all these embargoes, and with the naval blockade, America can't do business overseas. And so it can't get any of the manufactured goods that they've been getting from the previous, forever. And so the Americans start to build their own factories. They start to take our own natural resources and to build it. And so it's following in on both the American system by Henry Clay and by Alexander Hamilton's financial program from the 1790s. So this is finally American industry begins. This is just a picture or painting of the Capitol, and it's nuts. If you go to Washington D.C. now, it's about as congested and urban of a city as it can possibly be. And yet here in the 18 teens, you can see here's the White House. It's easy access by anybody to get to, and it's all wide open. And then over here is the Capitol building. Again, it's you can see there's nothing but fields and space in between them. Whereas nowadays it's just big building, big building all over the place, and massive amounts of traffic. It's kind of nightmare to get around nowadays. Post-war economics. So, I already told you that American industry begins during the War of 1812. Well, Great Britain realized this, and so they tried to kill it. And they tried to kill it because if Americans are buying American goods, then they're not going to be buying British goods. And throughout the war, British manufacturers, they were building goods, but they're unable to sell them because of the embargo and the blockade and all this other stuff. So their warehouses are just getting piled up with these finished goods. So after we formed the peace treaty, the Treaty of Ghent, British manufacturers try to flood the American market with these goods that are basically at cost or even below cost, because they're trying to recoup any amount of money to get off of these, and also to strangle and kill American industry. So that's upsetting. Despite the fact that you have these Jeffersonians who remember they formed the party in opposition to Alexander Hamilton's financial program, they vote again into existence in 1816 the Bank of the United States, which was a key component of Alexander Hamilton's financial program. So the Jeffersonians, following their leader, are extremely hypocritical in their political ideology. They also passed the Tariff of 1816, which again you remember is part of Alexander Hamilton's financial program. Except they take it a step further, whereas Hamilton had a very, very low tariff set in place for the purposes of raising revenue. This tariff is the first protective tariff in history. It's meant to try and block these British manufacturers. And so they jack up the rates to 20 to 25% interest rates. So not only are they going to raise a crap load of revenue, but they're also trying to foster a shield around domestic industry so that it can grow, so that it can sell its goods without competition from overseas. This takes it even farther than Alexander Hamilton ever would have dreamed of. So, again, another example of the hypocrisy of the Jeffersonians. Brings us to the American system, which I alluded to before, created by Henry Clay. So, with the death of Alexander Hamilton, America needed a new financial genius. And Henry Clay steps in and he becomes that guy. Henry Clay then proceeds to be a monster, not in a bad way, in a good way. He was a monster in American politics for about 50 years. I mean, he doesn't die until the 1850s, and he keeps avoiding sectional conflict and actual hostilities between the North and the South throughout this time period. Well, early in his career, he was more of an economics type of guy, and he basically invents the American system. The components of the American system look a lot like the components of Alexander Hamilton's financial plan, and I would guess that this is what Hamilton would have evolved into, and he would have been good friends with Henry Clay if Aaron Burr had killed him. So, a strong banking system that provides easy and abundant credit. So you need lots of, a centralized banking system, the Bank of the United States, and where this banking system just doesn't hoard money or sit on it in a mercantilism type of way, but actually then hands it out as loans so that other people can build factories and industries and stuff like that. A protective tariff. We already talked about that. At this time, it's at 20 to 25% interest rates on various goods. That's to prevent foreign competition with these new American industries. A network of roads and canals to get food and raw materials from the south and west to the factories and the cities in the north and the east. In the opposite direction, the manufactured goods that these cities and industries created would flow on these roads and canals to the south and to the west. That's going to cost a lot of money, and you fund it by the tariff, and the tariff also protects the stuff also. There's a big fight over this financial program between the old Federalists who wanted it, and they wanted the feds to finance this, in other words, the federal government to finance this. That would be something that Alexander Hamilton would have been a big fan of. And the Jeffersonian Republicans, who, even though they wanted this, they wanted roads, they wanted canals, they thought that this should be in the power of the states. Or it's that old fight between federal government versus state government. There's Henry Clay himself, the ugly dude. The Panic of 1819 and the Curse of High Times. So something that you're going to see in American history is that every 20 or so years, maybe 30 years, we have a financial panic, even in the modern times. The first big one is the Panic of 1819. And the cause of this is also one of the causes of the current recession. And in fact, it's almost always the cause of these periodic down cycles in the economy. Over speculation of frontier lands. Now, what that means is that too many people bought land out west, and then they weren't able to sell it. And so they bought high, and then they couldn't sell at all, or if they did sell, they sold it low. This is very similar to what happened in the mid-2000s. It caused the bubble to burst in 2007, 2008. Too many people bought houses. Too many people bought land. They couldn't afford it. They couldn't make their mortgage payments. And then boom, right? The price of everything goes down. So almost the exact same type of thing happens in 1819. What happens is the Bank of the United States forces its Western Wildcat branches. Remember, the Bank of the United States isn't a single building. It's, nowadays if you do banking at Bank of America, we'll say, or JP Morgan Chase, there's not just one central bank. There's branches all over the place. And so this was the same case with the Bank of the United States. It had branches in every state, and in some states multiple branches. And so the Bank of the United States as a central entity forces its western branches to call in the loans that they had been making to all these real estate speculators. And so they foreclose on a ton of mortgages, meaning a bunch of farmers who are unable to make their mortgage payments out west, they start losing their farms, they start losing their land. And so this causes a panic then of other banks trying to do the same thing. And then there's people who can't get loans then because the banks are worried that they're not going to be able to make their payments. And you can see there's no credit that's going out, and it makes it real hard for any money to come back into the banks, and a bank without money closes because it's not really a bank anymore. So you see a bunch of it just feeds on itself. Slavery and the sectional balance. Also in 1819 we get something called the Talmadge Amendment, and it was a bill passed in the House. Remember, the House is still controlled by Northerners because most people are moving to the north. It says that no more slaves should be brought into Missouri Territory. It also provides for the gradual emancipation of all the existing child slaves in Missouri. Now, this really pisses off the South, and they get very, very fearful because they feel that this is going to be a threat to the sectional balance. And the South, or I should say the pro-slavery people in the South, were becoming very worried because more and more people were moving to the north from overseas. And this was, more than offsetting the 3/5 clause of the South. So despite the fact that the slave population in the South is increasing, the population in the North is increasing at a much, much faster rate. And so every census, northern states are getting far more increasing numbers in the House of Representatives, and the South are losing members in the House of Representatives. So the northern interests are able to pass pretty much any bill that they want at this point in the House. Now, the only thing the South had to protect them was those 2 votes in the Senate. And if you looked at a map of the United States at the time, there was an equal number of slave and free states. So any type of anti-slave bill that might be passed by the House of Representatives could always be blocked in the Senate. But if Missouri enters the country as a free state, possibly because of the Talmadge Amendment, then this would throw off the balance in the Senate. This would give the North one more state. And so then any bill that the House passed would also pass the Senate. Now you have to remember though, we're still in the Virginia dynasty, right? This is James Monroe as the president at the time, so presumably they could still block it by a veto in the executive branch, but they didn't even want to get that. They didn't want to give up the Senate. So this brings us the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise is tested every year, so make sure that you know it. It's actually a series of 3 separate bills. It's packaged as one as far as U.S. history is concerned, but they were a few of them that they were passed over the course of several weeks that actually comprised the Missouri Compromise. Missouri actually comes in as a slave state, so no Talmadge Amendment. Maine, which had been this weird little unconnected offshoot of Massachusetts, it breaks off of Massachusetts and is admitted as a free state. So thereby, you're continuing the balance in the Senate of free and slave states. And they also say that slavery is prohibited in the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase north of 36 degrees 30. So if you look at the map, that's the southern boundary of Missouri is 3630. So it's you have the north, with the exception of Missouri, is totally free for all time as far as they were concerned in 1820. So that's how it feels like they're giving up more in this deal, but they still agree to that 36 degree 30 line, which you also have to memorize. That line is tested on a lot. Because if you look, that's the Great Plains. That's like Nebraska and Iowa and Minnesota, the Dakotas, and stuff like that. There's no way you're growing corn or tobacco in those areas. It just has nothing to do with that type of agriculture. In fact, that area was called the Great Desert back then because it was all just prairie, and they didn't think that you could grow anything in this prairie. So they weren't really concerned about slavery being economically viable in this area anyway. And here you see a map. So you've got Missouri comes in as a slave state. You got the tan states are the slave states. You can see this line, 36 degrees 30, is the southern most boundary of the free states. And you can see even over here, with the exception of Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, those are the only other states that are pro-slave states north of this line. What you can see here is how far south Illinois actually goes. And the southern tip of Illinois actually is a fairly pro-southern area during the Civil War, a few decades from now. You can see this is the unorganized territory here. So this would have been closed off from slavery. Oregon country, which we'll talk about in a second. Really, we don't even know if we own it or not yet. And then this is all part of Mexico, which we will take in chapters to come. And you can see over here, this is Maine, and you can see it wasn't even connected with Massachusetts over here. So it was kind of obvious that we should break off that from Massachusetts anyway. And so it was nice and convenient that we were able to do that. Okay, back to John Marshall. So we read about Marbury versus Madison last week. Now we're going to talk about a series of other cases where John Marshall, even though the Federalist Party is long dead now, he is still handing down opinions, and these opinions reflect Federalist ideology. So McCulloch versus Maryland, which we're going to read in class, it articulates, enunciates, whatever you want to talk about. It discusses and emboldens, empowers this idea of the implied powers, the elastic clause in the Constitution, strengthens federal authority by prohibiting states from infringing on federal entities. And this involved a fight between the state of Maryland and the Bank of the United States, whereby the state of Maryland tried to tax stuff that the Bank of the United States was doing. And so there's the famous line from the opinion, the power to tax equals the power to destroy. because essentially they could put $1 million tax on every single piece of paper that the bank would do. And so the bank refuses to pay any of these taxes, and $1 million tax would have destroyed the bank. And so it creates a fight between the federal government and the state government, and John Marshall clearly states that the state government, you can tax state stuff, but you cannot tax federal stuff because you could destroy federal stuff. So screw you, Maryland. Cohen's v. Virginia, 1821. This one, it gives the judicial branch, specifically the federal judicial branch, and even more specifically the Supreme Court, more power, or at least clarifies that to state that they already had that power. They always had that power. The right of the Supreme Court to review the decisions of state Supreme Courts in questions involving the powers of the federal government. So in other words, a state Supreme Court, if a case was brought in a state court about something involving the federal government, that's fine. And the person can appeal it all the way to the state Supreme Court. And if the state Supreme Court, rules, it still may not end there. And the reason why it may not end there is because the Supreme Court of the United States, the federal government, they have the power to decide, interpret the Constitution, not a state court decision. Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824. This involves interstate commerce, specifically the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And this gives the federal government the sole power to regulate, control interstate commerce. And really, the facts of this case are kind of dumb. It involves that the state of New York tried to give a company monopoly of a ferry service on the Hudson River between New York City and New Jersey. And if you were a company in New Jersey, you're kind of getting screwed by this. And if you're another company in New York, you're kind of getting screwed by this. And so there's the big fight, and it basically said that states, you can't grant those types of monopolies because you're involving money that's being transferred, commerce, between states, and that's solely within the power of the federal government. Now, what this does is, depending on how you define interstate commerce, depending on how you define the necessary and proper clause, which was analyzed in McCullough versus Maryland, if you say that basically anything can involve interstate commerce, and that anything is necessary and proper to further the goals of the previously stated powers in Article 1, Section 8, that the federal government can basically pass any law it wants to whatsoever, and it'll be deemed constitutional because of a broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause and a broad interpretation of the necessary and proper clause. That's more AP Gov stuff, but give you a little taste. Alright. Judicial dikes against democratic excesses. Fletcher versus Peck. This says that when a state law violates a federal law, specifically the Constitution, that state law has to go away. So there's another attack on states' rights, and you just have to know that it involves the impairing of contracts. Another one that involves the impairing of contracts is Dartmouth College versus Woodward, and it prevents state contracts from being attacked by their own states, and so that the state government can't dominate and it can't control corporations and stuff like that. This is Daniel Webster. It's quite the looker. In fact, I think this is our first photograph of the entire course. Technically, it's not called a photograph, it's called a daguerreotype because it involves glass plates and nasty chemicals and whatnot. But this is the guy, and he's in the House of Representatives for almost as long as Henry Clay, several decades. And he's, a closet Federalist, we'll call him. And in addition to being in the House of Representatives, he's also a lawyer who represents most of these pro-Federalist concerns in the Supreme Court. And so he's the one that's making the arguments in the Supreme Court. And then John Marshall, sitting on the other side on the bench, he's the one that's deciding in favor of Webster in all these cases. Alright, Oregon and Florida. So we have a pretty important convention that happens in 1818. It's not tested very heavily, but it really does affect our nation's history a lot. First one, not so much. The U.S. and Canada are going to share the waters off the coast of Newfoundland, and fishermen of both countries can fish there. The next one is fairly important. It fixes the northern boundary of Louisiana on the 49th parallel. So that creates a more solidified western boundary there. But the most important is it creates a 10-year joint occupation of the Oregon country. Now this is pretty unique in world history, where two countries are basically saying, yeah, we're just going to share that area of the world. I mean, think about how many countries go to have wars over lands that they both want. And here is Great Britain wants that land, America wants that land, and we have this long history now of going to war against each other. And despite this, just 3 years after the last war between the two of us, we agreed to share for the next 10 years this land. Now, shift your focus down south and east to Florida. Andrew Jackson, right, who'd been kicking so much ass in the War of 1812. He is a national hero. He knows it. He still has military command, where he's just kind of patrolling the border down there, being a tough guy. Well, he accuses the Seminole Indians and some fugitive slaves of hiding in Florida, which, right, was owned by the Spanish, but sometimes the British. The British still had posts there and all this other stuff. So he gets a commission, in other words, permission from the government to enter into Florida, but it's not an invasion. We're not declaring war on Spain, and he's just supposed to go into Florida and fix this. So in other words, put down this Seminole Indian rebellion that he claims is occurring, and to recapture these fugitive slaves that are hiding there. Well, what does Andrew Jackson do? He just invades Florida, and he just starts killing any Indian that he sees. He hangs 2 British subjects, and he was specifically in his commission. He was told, do not attack any Spanish cities. No Spanish posts, no forts, nothing like that. What does he do? He seizes immediately 2 Spanish posts, and he kicks out, he deposes the governor of Florida, the Spanish governor of Florida. So he comes in as a conquering military general. You can see this is the Convention of 1818 here. We've still got a disputed area here in Maine. Not a whole lot of people are living there though. And this gigantic area here, we agree to share with Great Britain. And then here, remember I told you this is where they agree to set this as the northern boundary. So the Adams-Onis Treaty. So you have here James Monroe as the president, his cabinet, and they want to, not just yell at Andrew Jackson, but Andrew Jackson make that he gets in trouble for doing this. However, John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, is the Secretary of State, and even though he's got some Federalist underpinnings, he supports what Andrew Jackson does because it's so important to get Florida, just so we can have a continuous block of territory there from water to water, and you don't have to worry about the border of Georgia anymore. You have to solidify it. So he supports Andrew Jackson. So he goes and he negotiates with Spain, and this results in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, where Spain gives Florida to the United States, and in return, all we did is we abandoned any claims that we might have in Texas. And we had no claims in Texas, really. It was really just this kind of murky, it wasn't part of the Louisiana Territory, but we had some people in Texas who claimed that it was, but it clearly was owned by and belonged to Mexico, which was, at this time, not for much longer, but at this time was still a colony of Spain. So we basically got Florida for nothing. And we got it because Andrew Jackson was an aggressive Here you can see Andrew Jackson and his route. Now, when we talked about those two Spanish posts, well, the posts were the city of Pensacola and the city of St. Mark's. So these were pretty big. You can see here, this is the Battle of the Horseshoe Bend. This was the Indian Massacre that occurs right here. There's the Battle of New Orleans, where this is a huge epic victory for Jackson. And then he kind of goes back, and then this is what he does in Florida. So for about 5 or so years, maybe 6 years, Andrew Jackson was tearing up a whole lot of stuff and killing a whole lot of Indians and British in this area down here. So pretty unique individual in American history. We're going to talk much more about him in the chapters to come. There he is. There's the young Andrew Jackson right there. Still pale, still male, but is not doesn't have the funky white hair or the frilly stuff. He looks like a badass, and frankly, he was. The Monroe Doctrine, tested heavily, kind of a BS thing in American history, but it is what it is. So James Monroe, in really just a speech, there's no official treaty or anything like that, articulates the Monroe Doctrine, and it's basically a message to the old world that they have to, for the most part, stay out of the new world. So no more colonization. So any existing areas that are in the new world, they're supposed to leave away or stay out of, and non-intervention. So the series of all these countries in South America and Central America are declaring their independence from mostly Spain, and we didn't want the old world to come in and either conquer these new fledgling independent nations or their former colonial masters to reconquer them. So basically, you can't do that. And it's what it does is it creates a situation where we are claiming that the United States is claiming leadership of the new world, of the Western Hemisphere. That's our sphere of influence, and that the countries of Europe need to stay in their sphere. Now, if they currently have a country, or I should say a colony in the New World, we're not going to interfere with that, and that they can still, that the old world countries in Europe, like England, France, Spain, that if they have existing colonies that are not in rebellion in the New World, that they can still run those colonies. The other one is the Russo-American Treaty of 1824. Russia had been slowly creeping down the coast of Alaska. At this time, they owned Alaska, and they were getting ever closer to San Francisco. And we were moving west. We were moving west. We knew that eventually we wanted that west coast there in the Pacific, and we saw that the Russians were possibly beating us to that coast. And so we actually formed a treaty with them, where we fixed the southernmost limits of Russia's colony at 5440 degrees. This is currently the southernmost tip of Alaska. Now, the weird thing is this creates a situation out there in Oregon country where you almost have now 3 big countries kind of sharing this land with kind of murky claims of it themselves. Us being one of them, Russia, and Great Britain. Here you can see this is that 5440. Here you have Oregon country now. Here you have now a pretty solidified boundary between Canada and the United States. And here you have the claims to Texas, which we gave up, never really had to begin with. It goes all the way over here. You can see Florida that we have here from Spain. So this is our boundary right here, and you can see we definitely wanted this part also. So that's what we're looking like in the early to mid 1820s. And our last slide, the chronology slide. You can see here a bunch of Venezuela starts to declare its independence in 1811. We get the start of the War of 1812. You get the Battle of the Horseshoe Bend in 1814. You get they burn Washington, D.C. that same year. You get the Treaty of Ghent signed at the very, very end of that year. You get the Hartford Convention, which is at the end of the year. The Battle of New Orleans, which happens in January of 1815. And then you can see in the aftermath of the war, you get the American system starts. Right? You get the second bank in the United States is founded, protectionist tariff of 1816. You have here Jackson invades Florida in 1818, the Anglo-American Convention, which solidifies those boundaries and talks about fishing and stuff. You got a first financial panic, that is the one of 1819. You also get the Adams-Onis Treaty. You get these two big Supreme Court cases, McCall versus Maryland and Dartmouth. The Missouri Compromise, which is huge in 1820. Colds v. Virginia. You get Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, the Russo-American Treaty. And that's pretty much it.